The Year of Faith, celebrating 50 years of Vatican II, is a production of CTNY, the Catholic television network of Youngstown. It seeks to share important information on the documents of the Second Vatican Council and how they shaped and changed the life of the Church. Your program hosts are Father Jim Korda and Father Jeffrey Mickler.
Hello and welcome to our show, Year of Faith, celebrating 50 years of Vatican II. I'm Father Jim Korda.
And I'm Father Jeffrey Mickler of the Society of St. Paul.
Our guest today is Father George Balasko. Welcome to our show.
Shalom.
And we're going to be discussing the document on non-Christian religions. But before we get into our discussion, I'm going to turn it over to Father Mickler, our expert, to give us an overview of Nostra Aetate.
Well, this is one of those documents that's a watershed, not only in the history of the Church, but the history of humanity. Because here we have the world's largest unified religion taking a different stance towards all of the other religions of the world than it traditionally had done. In preparation for the Vatican Council, there was a discussion that started, should the Church change its relationship with Judaism? But that quickly expanded to discussion of changing its relationship with the other great religions of the world. And there was a great deal of debate about this. Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, animist religions, what roles do they play in the history of cultures and in the history of salvation itself? These are touched upon in this very short but very important document of the Vatican Council, Nostra Aetate. George, you've studied this document practically all of your priesthood. What in it has so touched you, moved you, or formed your life as a priest?
Well, basically, it was over these years implementing it. And our relationship with the Jewish community especially, in the sense then would bleed out into the Islamic community. And basically there was a whole history of this, as you well know, in the sense in 74 the document, 65 the document comes out, but then in 1974, Nostra Aetate after 10 years in a sense, and we started the publication coming from the Sisters of Zion, and that website is on your hopefully on the screen, in a sense, is giving us an idea on how we get access to these documents, because it became a publication called CITIC, and it goes all the way from 1974 right up until 2008, and I think the last statement was with Cardinal Bernardin, and now they're not producing anymore the document, but they're at the Gregorian, and it's been my Bible on Jewish-Christian relations since Vatican Council II.
Yeah, so it's an ongoing process that this launched a lot of church thinking and a lot of official documents just on Judaism. Now, there are other documents on other world religions. This is just one volume of documents, not including the documents on Judaism, but other world religions that were published between 1963 and 1995. You would have about that high of volumes now if you put it into a book form, and that stack of documents in relation to Judaism will also be there. So there's been a great wealth of thought put in by not only the commissions in Rome, but the Holy Fathers themselves since this launching of Nostra Aetate.
Is it appropriate to say the document talks about relationships? Let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think to a certain extent it does, but it's the idea of roots, I think, more than relationships. Where did we come from? We're definitely stating that Jesus was a Jew, lived in the Jewish context of culture and background and interpreting the Torah. And after more Gentiles came into the church than the Jewish people were being lost to the church of the Jewish background, especially after the temple being destroyed, we see the Gentile Christians now forgetting their Jewish roots, which will cause us problems down the line.
I think also in regards to roots, the document talks specifically about Islam tracing itself back to Abraham. So it sees Islam as a cousin, you might say, even though John Paul II would refer to Judaism as our elder brothers, we might say because Islam traces its roots back to Abraham also, that maybe they're our cousins. I just coined that term. That's not an official in any of these documents. But that's the notion, that somehow the pivotal moment comes in the history of world religions a great deal from Abraham.
Obviously, we begin with that whole concept of God as the supreme being, as
definitely.
the one that is the source of everything. And where do we go from there then?
Well, then from us, in the sense, talking about Christians in the sense, the Word being made flesh, which is the Torah being made flesh in the Gospel of John, is strongly a sign for us that we're getting into the Trinitarian concept of the one God. And so the Word made flesh and then the coming of the Holy Spirit. This is very hard for the Jewish community, even for those who accepted Jesus, to accept. For those of you, we're dating this, but you're going to go to Mass and you're going to say, will you too leave me because I'm giving you the Eucharist? And so basically those who left were not the outside people, they were the inside people within the church, in the sense that this was too harsh for us to accept. And so basically as Gentiles then, we forgot about those Jewish roots, and we, how would you say, turned it around and blamed the Jewish people for a lot of things that the Romans blamed us for. So
let's talk a little bit about that whole concept, because I think that whole sense of the Jewish authorities and Jesus' death, obviously there's been lots of issues and misnomers about that. Let's settle that in light of the document on that whole
Well,
thing.
one thing is for certain, the notion that the Jews should in any way be thought of as the murderers of God or the killers of Christ, that was really squelched from this document, and it sets the tone for Jewish-Christian relationships. Even though I'm sad to say many Christians still think in those terms, and we hope and pray that over the decades that will fade more and more from our consciousness.
well, on the other hand, though, that problem came back in when we see the problem that the church was having with a group of bishops and priests out of France, in the sense that didn't accept Vatican Council II. That brought that back up in the sense of they are the killers of God. Here I have before us from the Bishops' Committee for Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs, The Bible, the Jews, and the Death of Jesus, a collection of Catholic documents concerning this. And so that's available from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. So, it's all there in a summarization of documents that have been released since Vatican Council II.
Also, there's this notion of not only a change of attitude towards Judaism, but the other world religions. And for example, Hinduism is described as an ancient faith mixing philosophy, meditation, and enriching myths to build a great civilization. Now, that is an enormous change in looking at these great religions, where they were pagans, they were wrong, they're filled with superstitions, there's nothing we could learn from them. Well, with this document, in a few sentences, it really shows the church's change of attitude in a very big way towards Hinduism, which is one of the great world religions. And that, I think, is an important aspect of Nostra Aetate.
And this is where we picked it up in a practicum, okay, with Rabbi Joseph Schoenberger at Temple Element. We just concluding a series of the role of calendars and the keeping of time. And basically we had it within Judaism in the sense in their calendar. Fran Amer, formerly with our directors of liturgy here, the diocese in the Catholic Church. And then we had the Hindus. And then we had the people from Baha'i, in the sense of different calendars and how they look at sacred time. And because of Nostra Aetate, that the Jewish people are being influenced in bringing into a synagogue these speakers in order to us to get to know one another.
Let's talk about that word respect. Obviously that word is fundamental in the document. Let's talk about how we live that in light of the document as Christians in dialogue with other Christian, non-Christian groups.
Well, we don't believe that everybody's exactly the same. There's not that leveling notion. We're proud of our faith, and we are confident that we have a really profound understanding of God that is unique to us and important to share with the world. But we also listen to other people, and as we do that, suddenly things in our own tradition become clearer, things that we hadn't considered before. Well, if we're just debating them, we're thinking how we're going to outdo them and not what can we learn from them. And I think that shows human respect between the groups.
This is a hard concept, though, because we still have people in a sense that we've got to change them. You know, even though we have the document in hand and what the church has taught, we're still in an old, how would you say, model that we've got to bring them around to think like we do. I think one of the, how would you say, the beachheads in this way back of happy memory, Thomas Merton, when he left the Trappist monastery and went over to Bangkok and to give a talk to all these different monks from different religions in the sense, and the role of that type of religious experience in the sense being shared. Of course, he died over in Bangkok, and he was against the war, and he comes back, his body is brought back with the bodies of the men who were dying in Vietnam, that he was speaking out vociferously against the war.
In Arnold Toynbee, the great theoretician of history from England, even in the 1950s, he sensed something, and he said, hundreds of years from now, historians of the 20th century will focus on something novel, that Catholic monks are talking to Buddhist monks. And Toynbee picked that up. This was going to be a sea change in human spirituality and human history. And I think this document has caused a lot of interchanging of monks between various groups coming to our monasteries. I remember meeting a Buddhist monk in a Benedictine monastery in Louisiana who was there to learn and also to teach.
We recall when Blessed John Paul II gathered people in Assisi. Tell us about that experience.
Well, there's a lot of criticism, thinking that he was praying with other religions and to the point of, and yet, remember within his heart, he's coming from Poland. There was an awful lot of anti-Jewish attitudes there, and he's asking forgiveness for the sins of individuals within the church that brought about a lot of conflict and hatred. And basically those who were still outside, not inside, but yet not accepting some of these things, found it they're very critical of John Paul II, that he was able to meet with these other groups and pray with them. You know, so basically it was a process of applying Nostra Aetate, but yet having difficulty to be accepted by members of the church.
Those two meetings are historic in every sense of the word and will be discussed for generations to come.
We are coming to the end of our first time together before we take a break. The one thing that I wanted to lift up and for us to talk about when we come back is that whole concept of spiritual bonds. You know, we are united because of God. We are united because of this supreme being. And so the spiritual bonds that we have somehow are very crucial to our dialogue and our continued talking and respect of one another in our time. So we're going to talk about that when we come back. Please stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to our show. Before the break, we were talking about spiritual bonds. Let's continue that discussion.
Well, one of the elements, too, that's touched upon here is not only the world's great historic religions, but also animism. And animism is the expression of faith found in the tribal peoples of the world. And they'll have all different expressions, but they have one thing in common. They see something spiritual behind every natural object, whether it's a bird, an animal, a tree, a river, a stream. And they'll have their stories about how those realities came about. Now, in the case of the indigenous peoples of North America, they see all of those stories as part of a greater story of a great spiritual father over all of us. And in this document, those ideas are to be respected. In the past, the missionaries would come in and try to do away with all those old superstitions. Oh, that's nonsense. That doesn't make any sense. Now we're seeing how sensical it is, not only for them, but how we should treat our environment ourselves and how we should live in this created world.
I think along with that too, because again, this is the aftermath of Nostra Aetate. This is important. It's from that document where the doors are opened up for other religions to actually look at themselves and to see what they have in common with this one God who is the creator of all. I find in the sense of some of our resources in the sense that put this together. Jesus was Jewish. He followed the Jewish calendar. Okay, so the Sabbath before the New Year, Rosh Hashanah, he goes home to his home village after being with John the Baptizer, and he says, "This is fulfilled in your midst." The blind are able to see and all that. When did the Jewish people read that on the Sabbath? That's on the Sabbath before Rosh Hashanah. But what's the main reading from the book of the Torah? Moses says, "Someone like me will come and lead you." And who's Moses talking about? Joshua. What's Jesus' real name? In the sense we say Jesus is a Greco-Roman name. Joshua. So he comes back from John the Baptizer and saying, "This is fulfilled in your midst." And he says something very interesting. This is a year of favor for the Lord. That may be the year of the 7th year when all debts were forgiven, or the 49th year when land had to be returned. And so then you know something about Jesus there, okay? And the idea of the religious connection with the roots in Judaism. So the spirituality is there, the importance of the Sabbath, the importance of the actual calendar dates of Rosh Hashanah, Passover, the Pentecost, okay? And also at the end of the year, Sukkot. Now what I find interesting is that there's a document group out of Jerusalem today, Bat Kol. Hopefully this is going to be on the generator, you're going to see this. And you get the Sabbath readings from a Christian point of view, and our interpretation from the Sisters of Zion. And then you also see the upcoming Sunday readings from the Judeo-Christian attitude. So, and then it flows into the Muslim tradition and stuff like that by not default, but the idea of just an allied thing. So the spirituality is there in a strong way, and I think we're getting back to that keeping the Sabbath is important, and then we move it to Resurrection Day, which is the day after the Sabbath.
And the Islam community, they have their holy day as Friday. And they have their own calendar with Ramadan, their own fasting. And those are very important elements to understand as the world shrinks and all of these people are going to be interrelated and interconnected more and more. We have to have that understanding. Hey, what's going on with our neighbor? Not in the Middle East, but down the road. And this is so important. Also, like in Hinduism, they have their feast days. Sometimes it causes conflict and tension in India itself. Like they have a day called Holy Day, but it's not spelled the same as ours, where everybody has fun throwing paint on one another, paint on the animals. It's a breaking down of the caste system, and the Muslims don't like to have paint thrown on them, and so or the Christians, that for that matter. So you have to see how different religions are going to accommodate each other with their traditions, their practices, and not have conflict and violence over them. And having Catholicism, having this document, we can be the bridge between all of these peoples, helping them to understand themselves better and their neighbors.
Let's talk about Muslim and Christian relations, if we can. If I recall, the document makes a statement that we should forget the past and strive for mutual understanding. What are they talking about?
Well, again, I think the past there is really past. Now we have the problems of what happened in September the 11th, and now, and even the misunderstanding these other people coming from the Far East, the Sikhs, thinking that they're Muslims, which they are not. And so basically we still have to educate the people in the sense there's something deeper here, and that we as an adult Roman Catholic Christian, that's who this document, or the document's intended for, that we have to understand these other people, that we have to love them, and we have to try to understand them. Maybe we can't accept some of the things they believe, but on the other hand, their freedom and their humanness in the sense of their one God to be followed.
One of the interesting aspects of this is that there was sort of an innocence about this document. They had in one subordinate clause an attempt to erase the Crusades, the battles, the conflicts, the jihad. So they said, we know essentially there's been problems in the past, but let's look for the future. But there are still problems in the present in the world in which we live. And we're hoping that by living our faith in a respectful way towards others, we're confident that that will stimulate in the vast majority of Muslims a respect and tolerance towards us. But that's still a hope. Hope's always based on something in the future, and that's our prayer. And we have to be careful ourselves in regards to how we treat other world religions, whether it's the animists, the Hindus, the Muslims, the Buddhists, etc.
What does the document specifically say about Jerusalem?
Well, it's a holy city. It is the capital of the three great religions. We all have our shrines there. And so basically it's a political thing right now on who is going to control it, where is it going to be. The École Biblique, which also has a document here that they're doing the new translation of the Jerusalem Bible. By the way, the Jerusalem Bible, it belongs to the École Biblique, and it doesn't mean that it's there from Jerusalem. And so basically, politically, if something should happen that control would go into the Palestinian control, the École Biblique is going to be in their territory. Right now, because of quote-unquote occupation, it's under the jurisdiction of Israel. So the political thing has to be separated from the religious thing. And so can we make Jerusalem the capital of three great religions and keep our shrines open in the way we worship God according to our different traditions? That's going to be the hard task, because again, that political thing gets in the way. But École Biblique is outside the Damascus Gate, and when you go in there, it's Palestinian territory that was taken over in the War of 1967. So it's there. So you're fighting with the politicians and stuff like that, and what we're looking at. Where should our embassy be? Where you have politicians always saying that.
In the history of the Crusades, the initial reason for the Crusades was in order to keep the shrines in Jerusalem open to pilgrims. That was the initial rallying cry. There was no sign that they had been closed, but and that started that huge series of regrettable and terrifying wars.
Now, the document is very specific when it talks about religious persecution. Let's discuss that, and where have we come and where do we need to go in light of persecuting people of faith?
I think Blessed John Paul II spent his entire ministry apologizing for the sins of the church. So it started by a self-examination of our own traditions, and whether in regards to Judaism, but other religions as well. And we actually published a book at Alba House, When a Pope Asked for Forgiveness, that chronicled all of the times the church had to say, let's acknowledge our past has not been godly at all times. Many times it's been ungodly in regards to persecution.
I think we have to be careful here. It's the individuals within the church, okay, because we talk about the church being mystical and all that, but how can it sin? So we have to be careful. There's individuals in the church. What I find very interesting is what happened in the early church. We were accused by the Romans that we were atheists because we didn't believe like the Romans did. We didn't have all the menagerie of God. Secondly, we were cannibalistic because we ate somebody's body and we killed a baby and we drank his body and blood. Okay, we're talking about the infancy narrative. Okay. Thirdly, basically we're incestuous because we married one another who believed like us, our brothers and sisters. After we forget our Jewish roots, we start to blame the Jewish people of what the Romans blamed us. Even to this day, just recently, people in Japan, in the sense of saying that blood libel, that the Jewish people capture someone at Passover time, they kill the child and they use the blood to make matzah. We see that in the Gospel of John, unless you drink my blood, and basically that turned people off. So that's not what the Jewish people do. But we were blamed in that way by the Romans, and we lost it and forgot it. And now and some of ours within the traditions of different parts of the world, in the sense, blame it on the Jewish people.
And John Courtney Murray, a great American theologian, was the main contributor to another document, the Declaration of Religious Freedom. And that has to be a part of our church, is consciousness that we're not going to try to set up political things to persecute people of other faiths, even if Catholicism is 99% of the population of any given country.
How do we, in our times, celebrate and further the declaration of Nostra Aetate today? What do we do in order to bring about communion with others?
Well, I guess I could take a beachhead on that. Jewish Christian studies. We went from dialogue to studies, and the rabbis who come into the Youngstown Diocese have been very cooperative, and then we lose them because they lose their contract and they have to move out. And so we've been doing that now for at least 35 years of my priesthood, in the sense of working with rabbis. And it's ongoing. You continue to learn from one another. And we had a speaker in for the Rabbi Meyer Memorial Lecture Series recently that after he gave his presentation, Jewish people saw me the next day and say, where can we go to these classes to learn something about Christianity? So I suggested A.J. Levine's New Testament annotated Bible for Jewish people, which has all kind of footnotes in the sense of how they are to interpret the Christian scriptures from their Jewish milieu.
And I think that we have to make more contact with the Hindus and the Muslims in particular, and visit some Buddhist monasteries.
And I think another thing is for us to look at those commonalities that we have. You know, our search for social justice, our search for moral values, our search for peace and freedom in the world. And so those commonalities, if we continue to work together on those, that obviously tightens and brings a spiritual bond together.
One more, humanness. We are, our God the Creator made us in His image and likeness, and we have to understand that not only for us as Christians, but also for the other religions. So.
Well, thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
The Year of Faith, celebrating 50 years of Vatican II, is a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program hosts were Father Jim Korda and Father Jeffrey Mickler.